Good morning, students. Today we're going to be talking about the cardiac cycle. I want to begin with reviewing the learning objectives. So after today's lecture, you should be able to identify the different structures of the heart related to the cardiac cycle. Hopefully that's a review for everyone. Then we'll be able to describe the cardiac cycle in terms of contraction or systole, as well as relaxation or diastole of the cardiac muscles, in particular the muscles surrounding the atria and the ventricles. Additionally, you'll need to be able to correlate the events of the cardiac cycle with both electrocardiogram tracings as well as auscultation readings. That's basically listening to the heart with a stethoscope. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about the relationship of the cardiac cycle and blood pressure. So to begin, we'll do a brief review of cardiac anatomy by just talking about where blood flows through the heart and through the body, with an emphasis on the heart here. So we'll start with oxygenated blood coming from the lungs. That will be flowing from the lungs through the right and left pulmonary veins, entering into the left atrium. From there, the blood will pass through the bicuspid or mitral valve. This is one of the two atrioventricular valves we'll be talking about. The bicuspid is what I'll refer to this as, even though it is also called the mitral valve. Over here we have the tricuspid valve that we'll get to in a moment. After the left atrium and passing through the bicuspid valve, the blood then enters the left ventricle. From there, it will pass through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta. From there, the blood goes throughout the body, providing nutrient and oxygen, providing oxygen and nutrients to the remainder of the body. It's then collected and pools in veins and is brought back through the superior and inferior vena cava to the right atrium. From there, blood travels through the tricuspid valve, the other atrioventricular valve we'll be speaking about today, into the right ventricle. And from there, the blood will then pass through the pulmonary semilunar valve back into the pulmonary arteries, where it'll split into the left and right arteries going to the left and right lung, respectively. So that just hopefully gives everyone a recap of where blood is flowing during this process, and that gives you a nice review of sort of the major structures that I want you to be aware of. So the cardiac cycle basically just describes the action from one heartbeat to the next. This cycle is composed of systole, or contraction of heart muscles, and diastole, or relaxation of heart muscles. The atria and the ventricles undergo systole and diastole in a very specific sequence in healthy humans, and when this cardiac cycle is disrupted, that can result in a variety of cardiac disorders. Some of those we will discuss at a later date, and we'll reference towards the end of today's lecture as well. So now we'll actually talk about the cardiac cycle. It's a cycle, so we could start anywhere, but we'll start here in the bottom left, where the atria and the ventricles are both undergoing diastole, so the muscles are relaxed there. At the beginning of this phase of the cardiac cycle, blood is flowing into the atria, but all of the valves are closed otherwise. The semilunar and AV, or atrioventricular valves, are all closed, so blood is only flowing into the atrium, left and right. As the pressure increases in those two atria, then blood begins to flow out of the atria into the ventricles, opening up those AV valves, the tricuspid and the bicuspid. This will result in about 80% of the volume of the ventricles filling up, and then we will transition from there to the actual first step of systole, or muscle contraction. We begin with atrial systole. So the ventricles are still undergoing diastole, and at this point, blood will continue to flow from the atria into the ventricles. So as the atria contract, that increases the pressure there, continuing to push blood into the ventricles, getting them pretty much completely filled. This will then transition from atrial systole to ventricular systole, and we'll go back to atrial diastole. So the atria will begin to relax, and as they relax and the ventricles begin to contract, that will increase pressure in the ventricles, pushing back on those AV valves, so that will close the bicuspid and tricuspid valve. Increasing pressure in the heart there will eventually cause the semilunar valves, both the aortic and pulmonary semilunar valves, to open. At that point, we get to the ventricular ejection phase, where blood is flowing out of the ventricles into the pulmonary arteries, or aorta. And that will then follow with the ventricles relaxing, resulting in ventricular diastole as well as continued atrial diastole, and we get back to the beginning of this cycle. Once again, it's a cycle, so the whole thing goes through again and again. You may have noticed these small diagrams here as we were talking. Those are electrocardiograms. We're going to go ahead and talk about that now and how those correspond with events occurring during the cardiac cycle. Electrocardiograms take electrical readings of the heart, as the name suggests, electrocardiograms. They can detect electrical activity occurring in the cells of the heart as it's beating. So we're going to go ahead and talk about the cardiac cycle, electrocardiograph. Here we see, we're going to actually start here at the same point we started on the previous page, where we're under both atrial diastole and ventricular diastole, starting after this T wave. So in this region, the atria and the ventricles are all relaxed, and then we get to the P wave here. The P wave corresponds to atrial depolarization, and then immediately after that, you get atrial systole. The atrial muscles begin to contract. So that continues to occur until QRS. These spikes here correspond to ventricular depolarization, and that's when the atria begin to relax again. So we get to atrial diastole, and then we begin ventricular systole, basically here around this S spike that lasts until the T wave. The T wave is the repolarization of the ventricles, and once we're there, we get back to the cycle, the beginning of the cycle that we just described. So this electrocardiogram basically lets you see all of the big events in the cardiac cycle using electrical leads. So that's going to bring up our first attendance question of the day. During a normal cardiac cycle, which valves will be open during the front period of an ECG electrocardiogram in the highlighted region shown here between S and T? So would it be the tricuspid and bicuspid valves, the AV valves, the semilunar valves, the aortic and pulmonary valves, the tricuspid and pulmonary semilunar valve, the bicuspid and aortic semilunar valves, or no cardiac valves are open during this time? Go ahead, take a moment, think about the corresponding parts of the cardiac cycle that we just talked about with the ECG here, and then choose what you think is the best answer, and we'll discuss it in a moment. Hopefully most of you selected B. So as we talked about earlier, that region between the QRS spike to the T wave, that is atrial diastole and ventricular systole. So the ventricles are increasing in pressure. Initially, all the valves are going to be closed, but very quickly after that, the semilunar valves are going to open as that increasing pressure in the ventricles pushes open those semilunar valves. So the correct answer is B, the semilunar valves are open at that point. All right, finally, we're going to talk about another method of reading the cardiac cycle. This is auscultation. That's just a fancy word for basically using a stethoscope to listen to the heart. It's a very fast, cheap, and effective way to assess the cardiac cycle. Depending what part of the heart you're interested in, you can listen to different regions on the chest and have a better chance or a better ability to sort of hear the opening and closing of these different valves. During auscultation, what you're actually hearing is the flow of blood past those valves as they're closing. So it lets you detect the closing of cardiac valves, and that's what you're actually hearing in those situations. We can also see some sort of pressure changes and how they correspond to that. So during auscultation, there's usually two sounds in healthy adults that you hear, sound 1 and sound 2, or S1 and S2. S1 is the lub sound corresponding to the closing of the atrioventricular or tricuspid and bicuspid valves. S2 is the dub sound corresponding to the closing of the semilunar valves. So you get that lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub that you've probably heard before if you've ever watched a medical drama or had any other chance to listen to this. Those are the only sounds usually heard in most healthy adults. Subpopulations like pregnant women, children, certain very serious athletes, they may have a third or fourth heart sound, this S3 or S4, and additionally individuals with various cardiac diseases or disorders may also have those S3 and S4 sounds. But we're going to primarily focus on S1 and S2 here. So make sure you understand what those S1 and S2 sounds correspond to, and then we're going to also talk briefly here more about how pressure changes during this. So as cardiac muscle contracts during systole, blood pressure usually increases locally. So in particular on this graph, we can see atrial pressure. There's small changes in atrial pressure. They're not quite as dramatic. The atria are relatively small. The cardiac tissue surrounding it is also relatively small, so you don't get this really strong pressure there. In the ventricles, however, you can see these very dramatic spikes in pressure, going from basically zero pressure up to about 120 millimeters mercury or atmospheres. It's a very strong increase in pressure. And also in the aorta, shown here in red, you can see that. So basically what happens here is during systole, when the atrioventricular valves close, you get this shooting up ventricular pressure as the ventricles contract and the blood is trapped in there until the semilunar valves open, and then that blood begins to eject into the aorta, so you can get a corresponding increase in aortic pressure, and that continues to increase until most of that blood has been ejected. And then as the semilunar valves close, that pressure falls, the AV valves open back up, and you start this cycle over again. If you had any trouble sort of combining any of these ideas, I would recommend this resource. It's really great. This will show you right here. You can see the sort of animation of the cardiac cycle, so you can see as where the blood is moving through the heart, what valves are opening and closing, and you can also see how that corresponds to these different aspects of an electrocardiogram, heart sounds from an auscultation, and changes in pressure. So you can pause it, you can go step by step, move through. It's a really great way to really understand how all of these different aspects of the cardiac cycle and different readouts that we have can correlate with one another. And that's something I really want you to focus on, understanding how an ECG corresponds to the actual cardiac cycle, how the heart sounds correspond, and how changes in pressure correspond as well. That's it for today. Thank you very much.